There's a moment after enough pain, after enough distance, after enough emotional exhaustion, when the narcissist suddenly changes. They become softer, kinder, calmer, more emotionally available. And for a second, it feels like everything you waited for is finally happening. The coldness disappears, the tension disappears, the emotional distance disappears, and suddenly they sound like the person you always hoped they could become. That moment is where many people get pulled back into the cycle. Because when a narcissist suddenly becomes nice again, it rarely feels manipulative. It feels emotional, real, almost healing, especially after long periods of confusion and pain. Because your nervous system has been starving for relief, and relief feels powerful after emotional deprivation. That's why this phase becomes so dangerous psychologically. Because now, you stop focusing on the damage. You start focusing on the possibility. Maybe they finally understand. Maybe they realize what they almost lost. Maybe this time is different. But here's what most people don't see initially. Narcissists often become nicest precisely when they feel control weakening. Not always consciously, not always strategically in some calculated way. But psychologically, they feel the shift. They feel emotional distance growing. They feel your energy changing. And that loss of emotional certainty creates discomfort internally. Because narcissists rely heavily on emotional access, attention, engagement, reaction, validation, and when those things begin disappearing, their behavior often changes suddenly. That's why the kindness usually appears right when you start emotionally detaching, right when you stop chasing, right when you become quieter emotionally. Because now, the narcissist senses something dangerous, loss of influence. And loss of influence changes their behavior quickly. That's why people become so confused during this phase. Because the narcissist suddenly starts doing things you begged for emotionally before. They listen more, communicate more gently, apologize more softly, act more emotionally aware. And after so much pain, those changes feel deeply meaningful. But here's the problem. Temporary behavioral shifts are not always evidence of permanent emotional transformation, especially inside narcissistic dynamics, because narcissists are often highly responsive to emotional consequences. When emotional access feels secure, the unhealthy patterns return. But when emotional access feels threatened, their behavior often improves temporarily. That's why the kindness can feel incredibly convincing, because part of it may even feel emotionally genuine in the moment. And this next part is what traps people repeatedly. Because once the narcissist becomes nice again, your brain starts rewriting the past emotionally. Suddenly, the pain feels less sharp. The manipulation feels less obvious. The emotional damage becomes easier to minimize because relief changes emotional memory temporarily. And emotionally deprived people often attach intensely to moments of emotional relief, especially after instability. That's why narcissistic cycles become addictive psychologically. The contrast itself creates attachment, pain, relief, distance, closeness, coldness, warmth, again and again, until emotional inconsistency starts feeling normal, and normalizing inconsistency changes your perception of love completely. Because now, you begin measuring love through emotional intensity instead of emotional stability. And narcissistic kindness often arrives with enormous emotional intensity. Suddenly, they become attentive again, affectionate again, emotionally expressive again, and your nervous system reacts immediately. Because emotionally, it feels like reunion, reconnection, hope, but hope becomes dangerous when it's attached to inconsistent patterns. Because inconsistent kindness creates emotional dependency. You never fully relax emotionally, you stay hyper aware, waiting for the warmth to disappear again. And eventually, it usually does. That's why so many survivors later say, the good moments confuse me more than the bad ones. Because the good moments created emotional contradiction. If someone hurts you constantly, leaving becomes emotionally clear. But when someone alternates between pain and affection, the attachment deepens. Because now, you're emotionally attached to potential, not reality. And narcissists often reinforce that attachment unintentionally. Because many narcissists genuinely fear abandonment emotionally, especially when they feel someone pulling away. So during separation phases, their emotional intensity often increases dramatically. They become more vulnerable, more expressive, more emotionally available. Not necessarily because deep transformation occurred, but because emotional loss activated fear internally, and fear changes behavior temporarily. That's why many narcissists suddenly seem emotionally evolved, right when the relationship feels closest to ending. Because survival mode activates emotionally. And emotionally threatened people often become highly adaptive temporarily. But adaptation is not the same thing as transformation. That distinction changes everything because transformation creates consistent change over time. Adaptation creates temporary behavioral adjustment, especially when emotional consequences are involved. And narcissistic relationships often operate through emotional adaptation cycles. When control feels secure, the unhealthy behaviors return slowly. But when control weakens, the warmth returns again. And this pattern creates enormous confusion psychologically because the nice version of them feels real, and sometimes part of it genuinely is. That's what makes the cycle so emotionally difficult to leave. Narcissists are not emotionally cold every second. They can be loving, attentive, affectionate, emotionally intense. But inconsistency changes the meaning of those moments completely. Because healthy love remains emotionally stable even after conflict. Narcissistic affection often becomes strongest when emotional access feels threatened. That's why the timing matters so much. Ask yourself, why did the kindness appear? Only after emotional distance appeared? Why did the empathy arrive? Only after you started detaching? Why did the effort suddenly increase? Only when you stopped chasing? Those questions expose the pattern clearly, because emotionally healthy love doesn't require the threat of loss to create care consistently. But narcissistic dynamics often intensify emotionally during instability. That's why the cycle becomes harder to recognize from inside, because every time you begin emotionally pulling away, the narcissist suddenly becomes the person you always wanted. And that creates powerful emotional confusion, especially when the new behavior feels sincere. Because sincerity in the moment doesn't automatically mean permanence. And this is where people lose themselves psychologically. Because eventually, they stop trusting their own perception entirely. The narcissist becomes cold, then loving, distant, then emotionally available, manipulative, then deeply apologetic. And your brain keeps trying to organize contradictions that never fully stabilize. That instability creates emotional exhaustion, but it also creates emotional dependency because emotionally inconsistent affection creates obsession. You keep chasing emotional certainty, trying to predict which version of them will appear next. And unpredictability keeps people emotionally attached longer than consistency often does. That's why narcissistic kindness after cruelty feels so powerful psychologically, because your nervous system experiences it as relief, almost like emotional oxygen returning after suffocation. And relief after pain can easily feel like love, even when it's part of the same cycle hurting you. This next realization changes everything for survivors, because eventually you stop asking, were the nice moments real? And start asking, why did the kindness only appear after emotional distance? That question creates clarity, because clarity exposes timing, and timing reveals patterns. Now the cycle becomes easier to see emotionally. The warmth wasn't random, the softness wasn't random, the sudden emotional awareness wasn't random. It often appeared during moments of emotional threat, moments where the narcissist felt your detachment growing. And once you recognize that pattern, the emotional illusion weakens, because now you stop confusing temporary emotional intensity with permanent emotional change. And emotionally healthy relationships depend on consistency, not temporary emotional rescue phases. That's why many narcissists seem incredibly loving during reconciliation, but emotionally unavailable during stability. Because reconciliation restores emotional access, and restored access reduces emotional urgency again. That's when old patterns slowly return. Criticism, distance, withdrawal, control, emotional inconsistency, again and again, until the cycle repeats completely. And this repetition is what finally wakes many people up emotionally, because eventually you realize the kindness always had condition attached. The warmth appeared when you were leaving. The affection intensified when you became unavailable. The effort increased when emotional control weakened, and conditional affection is not emotional safety. It's emotional instability. That's why healing changes your perception completely, because eventually you stop getting hypnotized by temporary emotional shifts. You stop interpreting sudden kindness as proof the relationship is finally healthy. You start looking for consistency instead, accountability instead, stable emotional behavior instead. And consistency exposes everything, because real change sustains itself over time, not just during emotional emergencies. That's why awareness becomes so powerful after narcissistic abuse. Now, instead of asking, why are they suddenly so nice? You begin asking, what changed emotionally that caused the behavior to shift? That question reveals a structure underneath a cycle, because narcissistic kindness often intensifies when emotional access becomes uncertain, and uncertainty activates emotional urgency. But urgency is not the same thing as healing. Real healing creates stability. Real emotional growth creates accountability consistently. Real love doesn't disappear until control feels threatened. And once you understand that, something inside you changes permanently. You stop getting emotionally pulled back by temporary versions of someone. You stop mistaking relief for transformation. You stop rebuilding hope every time the warmth returns suddenly, because now you recognize the pattern underneath the affection, the cycle underneath the kindness, the fear underneath the sudden emotional availability. And that awareness protects you emotionally, because now their kindness no longer blinds you. You can finally ask the question that changes everything. If this version of them was always possible, why did it only appear when they felt you slipping away. And once that question becomes impossible to ignore, the cycle starts losing its emotional power over you. Because now, you don't just see the affection, you see the timing, and timing changes the meaning of everything.